morning, everyone. I have a preparatory question. Does anyone here not know what SARA is? Okay, you may want to find another session. But welcome. We made a change in the program. Marianne Boki was supposed to be one of the speakers, the president of NC SARA. She came down with what originally looked like COVID, fortunately, or depending on how she handles it, it appears she has flu. But substituting brilliantly is Phil Hill Associates, and I think probably more people here know Phil than know about SARA. And let me proceed. This is kind of a framing slide. SARA is the obvious woman on the saw table, and the buzzsaw is variously the Department of Education, student consumer advocacy groups, et cetera. But it's those who think that, I suspect most of us in this room think is a wonderful idea, is not so wonderful an idea. And we're going to talk a little bit about some pending changes that may make the distance between the redhead and the buzzsaw a little closer. We actually have, is myself, we have Pat Lane, who is the Vice President, Policy Analysis and Research at WICHE, the Western Interstate Commission on Higher Education. There are 4 national compacts that really compose the core of the NC SARA structure, because the whole approval process, review process of the states flows through the regional compacts. So if anybody is unhappy with SARA, you should be really yelling at the regional folks. And I don't think Phil needs much of an introduction. He has one of the most perceptive and thorough blogs on higher education, and particularly federal and state policy relating to higher education, and I'm deeply grateful for his willingness to step in. Very briefly, a quick slide on what is SARA, and while you are reading that, I'm going to turn to Pat and really talk about what we're dealing with now with SARA and with the federal government, and what we refer to as negotiated rulemaking. And I'm just going to flip quickly through the slides. NEGREG, March 4th through 7th. And the answer, and that has consequences. And Pat, it's yours.
Sure, okay. With that as intro, again, I'm Pat Lane from the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Ed. And I'm here to speak on behalf of the SARA community, which is a broad and strange group of folks working together. We have state regulators, we have these things called SPEs, state portal entities, and there's actually no one person that can speak because we don't agree on everything. But I'll give it a shot and end up inevitably using a lot of passive voice to avoid accountability. So negotiated rulemaking was held, and it did fail on this particular issue. There were a lot of broader issues that were discussed, generally taking aim at distance ed, and I think Phil could talk more about that at length. But here we're focusing specifically on the portion of NEGREG related to state authorization. And within that state authorization, there were actually different parts. So we're going to focus exclusively on the state authorization reciprocity agreement components.
You want the
sure. Slides. So did folks tune in to NEGREG? Show of hands, you followed, you read what? You read Phil's blogs on it? Anyone who did that instead of watching was infinitely more productive than the rest of us over the first quarter of the year, so you're in good shape. Essentially, the key thing to know about SARA is that its foundational principle is that states agree as part of their voluntary participation not to enforce their own authorization requirements on out-of-state institutions. That's the extent of reciprocity. There's a lot more, as you get into the details of policy, but that's the foundational piece of it. It does not affect, and this is important for our broader discussion, states' general purpose laws. These include fraud, misrepresentation, harassment, other things. So that's important as we get into some of the details. Now, some people don't like that. And I have to acknowledge that there are some states that do participate that would prefer that we allow them to enforce their own education-specific authorization requirements. Certainly not all the states, and certainly not the majority of states by any stretch, but they do exist. But on the other side of the coin, the department and some of the SARA critics believe that this is a problem and that students would be better served if states enforce their own education-specific requirements. They don't exactly present a lot of evidence on this. And I think that's one of the things that we're concerned about as we go forward. So within NEGREG, there are essentially 5 areas where we are concerned. And we don't have the detail up on the slides, but we can provide that if you need it. First is what we refer to shorthand as the 500 rule. And this is a proposal, and this all comes from the last proposal that the department released, and this was on the day before NEGREG ended. So we didn't have a lot of time to adjust or put counter proposals on the table. But one was the 500 rule. This means that institutions would be required to obtain direct authorization from any state in which they enroll more than 500 students. I think it's for 2 consecutive years, and it's FTE. And then they're required to get direct authorization within the next year. So that's one. That would undermine, obviously, SARA's general principle that you don't have to have direct authorization from a state. Second is that a state authorization reciprocity agreement would not be allowed to prevent states from enforcing their own closure requirements. And here the department hearkened back when they defined closure requirements, they hearkened back to their last rule that actually goes into effect this July that does not affect SARA on closure requirements. And they defined those closure requirements as including student tuition recovery funds, surety bonds, teach-out plans, and records retention. So these are sort of standard closure things. So this would allow any state that participates in SARA to enforce their student tuition recovery fund, require institutions that are out of state to pay into that fund or to obtain surety bonds if they so choose. They're not required to, but that starts to chip away at that foundational piece of SARA that I mentioned at the top. The third piece that would change SARA is it would allow states to revoke reciprocal authorization for an institution if they are found to violate any of the state's general purpose requirements. That on its face doesn't sound too bad, and there are ways within SARA that if you do violate states' general purpose laws, you could be found in violation of SARA's policies and then booted from the whole agreement. But this would sort of allow it on a one-off basis. If you are found if you have an institution in Colorado, you're found by the Massachusetts Attorney General to violate their fraud provisions, they could say, we're no longer going to accept your SARA authorization. You have to come to us and get direct authorization. It also, I think, as we look at some of the different DEI laws around the country, you begin to see some potential areas where this could lead to a lot of conflict. Fourth was the issue of complaints. There's a handful of changes on complaints. Some of them are actually already in practice across most of the SARA universe. The one that would change SARA somewhat is that a student's home state would be allowed to investigate and resolve complaints against institutions that are located out of state. Not every state has that jurisdiction in their own statutes, so it's not clear how broadly that would apply. That isn't as foundational, and I think there are ways to work around that when we get into SARA policy, but that would be a big change. And the last one would impact the NC SARA board. The department, this was one of the concerns they mentioned from the jump, that they were concerned about institutional representation on the NC SARA board. They came up with a bunch of proposals and ended up with a proposal that only state regulators and or attorneys general could serve on the NC SARA board. The SARA community put forward an alternative that essentially took all policymaking away from the NC SARA board, and they don't really have a strong role anyway. Without going into the weeds of SARA governance, essentially states are already in control of the policymaking process. So some might say, and that's not quite passive voice, but you see me avoiding accountability. Some might say that that's a solution in search of a problem. So those are the top 5 things I think that would dramatically impact SARA. And if you take a step back and think about what's going on, the folks that are proposing these from the SARA critic side and the department generally operate under the assumption that SARA and its model of reciprocity benefits predatory institutions and enables them. So anything that chips away at that reciprocity by definition benefits students. I think the opposite is actually the case. There's a very strong argument that SARA overall has improved student protection. And then the corollary would be anything that chips away at SARA has the potential to erode student protections. So it's not as cut and dried as the department and SARA critics make it out to be. I think in the coming months, and we can talk about what's happening next and down the road in a second, we'll be making that case. And again, it's sort of a broad, diverse community, so it's not like we'll have a single issue paper on it, but we'll be working on alternatives and putting that out.
I want to add a footnote to what you said on a couple of these. One is that you'll notice that it says making states enroll more than a certain number with an asterisk, and the number that was mentioned is 500, and that was sort of a number floated which seemed to be taken forward. What happened was that NC SARA did an analysis of how many institutions would actually trigger that, and it was it had to be at least 3 states that had the 500 number. Was that the trigger, I think?
No, it's just in a single state, you have to go get authorization.
But it was the number of institutions that they chose, the 60-some-odd institutions that they found, was 1 state.
Yeah.
Okay.
That had a.
So there are only about 60 institutions that enroll more than 500 students in any state online, in any state other than their home state. Mm-hmm. And that was rather shocking to the naysayers, because they were assuming that there was this huge mass of institutions with this issue. So there is certainly the possibility that the department will be lobbied to reduce that number from 500 to 200, 100. And so you can see, again, this is an issue that doesn't actually have a problem. And again, we all know that in online learning, there's about a 150-mile radius where the vast majority of students. So that's one that likely is going to have some lobbying done. The other one, which nobody talked about, is DEI. And the problem there is that, we think of Florida and the DEI rules applying to the universities. A lot of states have implemented anti-DEI rules that are general applicability, so that they would definitionally fall outside of SARA. And that was really, I think, was not discussed in Neg Reg, and that is one of the issues that will need to be probed carefully. We'll go through the process in the comment period, so the department is aware of the hornet's nest that they are potentially kicking.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And the negotiator for states, Rob Anderson from SHIO, brought that up, and then the train kept rolling down the tracks. I think on the 500 rule, it was, for those of you that tuned in daily, it bordered on comical to watch the department's negotiator try to avoid using the word arbitrary, because that obviously is, as my legal colleagues would say, has very real complications for the department. And he mentioned NC SARA's data analysis. What was also interesting for outside observers was that the department came up with the rule of 500. Then NC SARA said, we have data, so you can analyze it and determine how many institutions it would impact. And then they came up with essentially a post hoc justification. And then the SARA critics came back and said, well, we've got to ramp that number down lower because it doesn't catch enough institutions. So there was no assessment of risk. They kept talking about we need risk-based policies. There's no assessment of risk. It's just we need our certain number of institutions to be captured by this, and I think that's incredibly problematic. I would say our region in the West, as we've been working on the SARA policy process and thinking about ways forward for the last couple of years, has been very active and vocal about how we could thoughtfully increase consumer protections and have a true risk-based approach. Because I think we look at compliance and the compliance burden, undoubtedly SARA reduces that. That's one of its key features. But I think that's a feature, not a bug. I think compliance burden can become a carrot as well as a stick. If you are a good institution, a low-risk institution, why should we be making things difficult for you? And that's not the direction we're going. So what we didn't see throughout those fateful 3 months was any true definition of what the department meant by risk, and I think that's crucially important. Are we talking about risk of closure? Are we talking about risk of poor academic outcomes? Are we talking about risk of fraud and other violations of general purpose laws? And if we could get a clear definition of that, I think we could really move forward on some thoughtful policies and approaches.
You want to move to the process?
Sure.
You got the clicker.
Oh,
You do the process.
Okay, so what's
then
happening
I'll hand
now?
it over. Yeah.
Okay, so what happens now? The department, Mike mentioned it's failed. Some cynics often say that neg-reg is not meant to get to consensus, and after neg-reg, the department writes what it wants. That's where we are now. The department will come out with a proposed rule. I think it's clear as day to any observer that state authorization and reciprocity agreements is a priority for them. The key is when they come out with the proposed rule. We expect that it will be this summer because this department on regulatory matters, leaving all other snark and commentary aside, has shown that they can meet regulatory deadlines and get rules out by that fateful November 1st deadline. If they get to a final rule by November 1st, whatever they finalize would become law by July 1st, 2025. If they miss that deadline, we're looking at 2026. The public comment period is likely to be only 30 days. That's what they did on Gainful. That's what they've done on other things, so I don't see any reason they would deviate from that. We looked at the calendar they used for the last big regulatory packages, and we're probably looking at May or June for a proposed rule. I think it's also worth pointing out that what we've just discussed is probably not what's going to come out. This was the only issue among several very high-profile issues that were part of neg-reg where the department essentially issued a threat. And it was crystal clear to those watching neg-reg, and they said, here's the deal that's on the table. If you don't take this, there is no guarantee that we won't come back with more stringent regulations when we come back with a rule. They did not mention that on accreditation. They did not mention that on cash management, anything else. And I think that was interesting and somewhat telling. So I think what we expect is not necessarily what I've talked about. We certainly could see things that chip away at other parts of SARA and attack reciprocity more broadly.
So one thing well, first of all, I'm at a disadvantage. I don't know the details to the level certainly that Mary Ann does, but that gives me the freedom to, without too much snark, look at the bigger picture. And it's really interesting that this topic of SARA regulation is both very important. It's going to impact a large number of programs, particularly nonprofits and small programs, at a time when schools are trying to deal with it. But it also seems on the surface very wonky, like it's a detailed regulation, little adjustments here or there. And I think it's important to take a step back and sort of see the bigger picture, including the fact that this is connected to historical activities and it's connected to other regulations. But just to sort of personalize a little bit, I also do consulting. One of my consulting clients is the Colorado Community College System. They're changing how they do online education to do much more of a consortium approach, course sharing. Part of it is so you have rural colleges who wants to offer a program, but they can't fill up the courses and make it economical. So they bring in students from other colleges, they work together, and they create more of an online presence for what the students need. And historically, they have been very online course-based. For them to meet their strategic goals, they really need to start focusing much more on online programs to do this. So they do have a long history of online education, but they need to adapt to the new enrollment and financial environment. They need to adapt to changing student needs. This is a public community college system. Well, a couple of notes about them, and I don't mean this in a bad way, but they hardly know about the subject at all. And I think that, as a matter of fact, there was just an email thread yesterday I was on with them explaining you need to pay attention to this, and other people are catching up. So one of the points is this isn't well known. You have these very large changes, and the schools that are going to be impacted quite often don't get the impact of it. Second thing to note, this is not the predatory institutions, even if you accept that argument that that's a big problem. Do we really want to hamstring community colleges who are trying to find better ways to serve students? And whatever happens with the details, it's going to add to the bureaucratic overhead. This is course sharing. Well, what happens if you have an academic program offered by a home college, but you have several teaching colleges? It's packaged together. When do you hit the 500 limit? Is it for the state? Is it for the college? There's a lot of unknowns in here, and they will be paying, nothing personal, Mike, they're going to be paying lawyers to help them figure this out.
There's one over there. I'm not doing that anymore.
Oh, well, okay, former background.
Recovering.
But my point is, it adds to the burden. But the point is, this really matters to a large number of programs. I've also consulted with large for-profit programs over the years. And let me tell you, and people probably know that, they have an army of compliance officials. They, even before SARA, they're out there dealing with this subject. How do we comply with each state? And it's not just initial authorization. How do you deal with the rules? How do you deal with student complaints? They have armies of people doing that, which are expensive. You know who doesn't have an army? Is the vast majority of smaller programs who are trying to figure out what to do. So ironically, this actually is going to make it easier for the large online institutions when in fact it's coming across like it's different. So the background and what I'd encourage people to say is, while it's wonky and important, but see the connectedness. When the compacts were coming out and states were choosing to be part of it or not. And by the way, if you haven't read, highly endorse Mike's LinkedIn post on this. I had some great historical context stuff I didn't understand. But I'll just add one piece to it. In California, that was the one state that did not sign the compact. There was heavy lobbying from activists to keep them from going. And there was a reason for that. They want to use that as yet another tool to go after predatory institutions, which is a vague term, but they don't want to have this approach where they don't have that tool in the toolbox. So what happened in California is when they initially did that, blocked them or prevented them from agreeing to be part of it. I don't know if people remember, the state of California lost access to federal financial aid for 2 or 3 months back in 2018 or 19, because they actually, as a state, didn't have the processes in place that are required to do student complaints. And so they were very much wanting this consumer protection. I want to go after predatory institutions. The net effect was they actually lost financial aid access for students for a couple of months for all institutions there. They were able to get the state government to recover. But I mention this as this is not an issue that came up in 2023. There's a historical thread of consumer protection advocates who really do not like this, and it's very much counter to certainly what I believe is useful and what a lot of public institutions, private institutions, all across the board say they'd like to do. The other piece of connection is, and Mike alluded to this, we've been writing about the fact that with so much of the regulations going on, they're targeted really at online education. Not just OPMs, not just for-profits, but online education by its inherent nature, a lot of people believe it's predatory. And there's sort of this common view within the Department of Ed, but the people allied with them, the activist groups, the foundations behind this. And that's a lot of what we're seeing. So we mentioned the negotiated rulemaking. There's a skepticism that online education and its various forms are harming students. So we've got, the way to help these students is to treat them as predatory and try to control that, if you will. What's important, I give them credit, they do want to protect students. They have, I believe, a common goal with most people. Let's protect students for closed programs, et cetera. But the problem is, take it this way, Mike's post on LinkedIn calls out so many of the problems and the history. And then Patrick was just describing during the negotiations, people were saying, well, here's data, that if we want to protect students, let's look at the data. The fundamental problem we're dealing with is that there's a lot of people with the mindset of any kind of feedback or pushback on what's appropriate gets interpreted as, oh, you're just trying to avoid oversight. So what we're dealing with here is we do share, in my opinion, common goals sort of across the spectrum. But the real dispute is what's effective federal policy, and what's really broken, in my opinion, is the ability to listen to counter proposals, data, suggestions, and say, okay, let's try to figure out how to make this better, or decide, hey, we have something that works right now. So I just want to emphasize how big the connectedness is between these different areas, if you will.
We have a small, but I expect interested group, and I want to throw this open to discussion and questions. There's a lot of expertise up here on the stage, but I expect there's expertise in the audience as well. So let me first ask if anyone has any particular questions for the members of the panel. And John. John.
Hopefully a softball that won't get anybody into trouble with your answers. I fully agree with the online comment because, Phil, I agree with you. There were so many different aspects of this neg reg that I think call into question the department's trust of online education, distance education generally. Well, my question is more about the triad and the role of states and accreditors in the department in the federal student aid triad. And related to that, NC SARA's recently proven ability, as was mentioned by Pat, to review and enhance its standards. Is this a renewed distrust by this department in the triad and the view of the department that the states are capable of continuing to serve the consumer protection function as the states see fit without necessarily the federal government having to do that? Because we see some of that with the accreditor side. So just maybe some comments on how this fits into the broader discussion about the role of the triad in protecting students as well as protecting taxpayers while also allowing institutions to thrive.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and there's a long history of federal unease with the triad in general. And it really goes back to the notion in federal student aid that it's our money. And, you know, we really don't trust you folks to make sure our money is being spent properly. But the SARA is a result of a process that started, pardon me, good clean San Diego air, that started in 1985, when one of the state higher education executive officers was speaking at a conference on controlling branch campuses across state lines. And he got up and said, you folks are perfecting the Pony Express while the telegraph wires are being strung. And that was when distance education was by television and by bicycling videotapes. Remember videotapes? 1985. And then there was a project to analyze that and to come up with a solution. And the states and the then Association of Accrediting Agencies got together and came up with a solution. And the solution is remarkably like SARA. And the accreditors ended up agreeing with it, and that's how the multi-regional compact came into being, where one accreditation is good anywhere in the country. The states couldn't come to agreement for a simple reason. There were some states like New York that had very high standards. And they said, if we do a compact that takes our standards, we're good. And then there were other states like Louisiana where the Head of that agency says, we're fine if everybody takes our standards, and by the way, if you do, you're out of your cotton-picking minds, direct quote. Because theirs were, send us a postcard, you're authorized. The divergence was so huge that there was no way to rely on that. What SARA ultimately accomplished was an agreement among the states that there is a common level of compliance. That was an enormous breakthrough. And there is still a sense among, in federal student aid and in outside groups defined as student protection groups, and I think it's a misnomer, that if you support online learning, you inherently are not supporting student protection. And we can't rely on the states to do that, and we can't rely on the accreditors to do that, so we have to make this a more difficult process. But we are so far away from where we were in 1985.
Yeah. I would add just a quick color to that. And my view is that the federal government, they don't trust the state level policy making to have an active role in here's what we want. But what they do like are the attorneys general giving them flexibility to create lawsuits and go after people. So they support that part of the state, but not the policy level. So it's sort of different parts of the state, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would fully agree with that. And then add, it's very interesting because I think there is a distrust of the states, yet they are relying more on state enforcement, particularly by those attorneys general. And as I mentioned at the top, attorneys general today can go after any institution they choose for fraud, misrepresentation, harassment, you name it. We heard over and over again during NEGREG in the student comment section about students who are mistreated and defrauded by institutions, and that is a real thing that happens. What we did not hear was attorneys general saying, oh yeah, we're going to go after them now. We have done an analysis of how states pre-SARA went after what were clearly predatory institutions. They're the names that come up in every regulatory conversation. Not once did they use higher ed authorization requirements. They exclusively used general purpose fraud misrepresentation statutes. So that, I think it's great frustration to the, what I would term the consumer protection community of state regulators, because that is their job, and I think that's something that gets lost in these SARA discussions.
Sure.
So forgive the simple question. I'm at a private of about 4,200 students or so. Since COVID, our on-campus students take over 50% of our on-campus students are in the online environment. So we're seeing a seamless future where you can't tell the difference between in-person and online. The students are the same, essentially. Is there any recognition in this process that that is coming, that they're really not two separate entities, online versus in person?
I think it's the opposite. Is if you look, one of the other things they're introducing is a virtual location for online program work, and trying to, which will improve data, by the way, but I think they're actually pushing the opposite direction. It's a very binary view. So I think I didn't hear any acknowledgement of what you're saying, the mix and match, fluid. I think they view it as two distinct areas, is my read.
Yeah, and then you're into determining where your student is when they're taking that course, which is in some ways easy, in some ways very difficult, particularly, I don't know where your campus is located, but if you're near a state line, I think things get very interesting very quickly.
But excuse me, but there is an image of the online institution that's in an office building and has X tens of thousands of students across the country. And that's what they're thinking of. And the fact is much more like what you've just described, where an institution, small, medium, large, has evolved, pardon me, into a hybrid exercise, into a hybrid institution. There is zero recognition of that fundamental transformation in higher education. This is not unusual for the Department of Education, which is legendary for being decades behind the changes occurring in education. The technology revolution, what we're seeing here with 7,000 of our closest friends, is that education generally, higher education particularly, has radically transformed. If you look at the federal regulatory framework, there is almost no recognition of that change.
Yeah, I would definitely agree.
And we see time is still supreme.
Yeah.
Sir.
I'm from Franklin University in Columbus, Ohio. We're 8,000 students, mostly online, all but about 0.5%. So we stand to be impacted in a large way. I wonder, and who knows what's going to happen with the election this year. And, you know, there's bipartisan support for some sort of oversight. I understand that. But I wonder if a change in administration might have any impact on this or any other sort of rulemaking.
I mean, it'll definitely have an impact, but we're getting a lot of pressure to try to address this question in our writing. But there would definitely be an impact with the change in administration, and there's a lot that would go away. But even that would not be simple, all right, things have changed. You're talking, particularly if it's built into the regulations, 2 to 3 years to undo previous regulations. So there would be a different change in direction, but this issue would remain a significant one unless there were a lawsuit. This is America, so we run by lawsuits. That is my view. So my view is it would change the direction, but there would be at least a 2 to 3 year lag before it changes reality.
Yeah, recognize that if this rule is promulgated, the ability to change the rule again in the next administration, and by definition, if it's a change in administration, it's going to be a one-term administration.
Yeah.
It's not great. I mean, the process intentionally is very slow,
Yeah.
so that you don't get as much whipsaw as might otherwise be the case. So are there going to be changes? And we can look from Obama to Trump to Biden, but it has not been spiky changes. They've been, it's certainly in higher education, they've been relatively smooth. So yes, but. And, and part of the but is, what's going to be, where is attention going to be paid? And, you know, how high is this going to be? Is this a Trump day one? You know, I'm going to deal with, and I would wager vast sums of money, if I had vast sums of money, that the answer to that is no. And, but, you know, we don't know the answer. That is a total unanswerable. And we thought there were going to be dramatic changes in, you know, the Trump administration after Obama, and, you know, relatively minor.
But I will point out on the accountability and the holding schools to have value in programs, that's actually fairly consistent on both sides of the aisle, at least with what's getting proposed. But I think Mike brings up a huge point. There's so much to deal with if we go to a Trump administration. Nobody I know of knows what that priority would be, and this is wonky. This might be way down.
Now, and again, it's not just the administration; it's Congress. There may actually be a possibility that someone's going to try to reauthorize the Higher Education Act. Virginia Fox is trying to do that. Her proposals, and she's a pretty conservative Republican, you know, for the most part, aren't crazy. And again, there is, oddly enough, there's a leavening force in the Congress that smooths out the bumps. So administration may change, Congress tends not to. We have 1 minute and 8 seconds. Is there another question or comment? And if not,
I have a question, if you don't mind. Does Chevron, and I'm looking at you two, will Chevron, if that gets overturned in the Supreme Court, will that change the dynamic and further smooth out the process of not the whipsaw regulation?
I would defer to my legal colleague, but he's going to take way too long to answer. So the answer to that is very possibly, because for those who don't know, the Chevron doctrine is deference to the decisions of the head of an agency. That if it is reasonable, regardless of whether it's clearly the intent of Congress, then so gainful employment is a good example. There are 10 words in the law. Those 10 words were in the regulation. 50 years, that's how gainful employment was defined. Employment education that results in employment, defined employment. That was changed to this enormously complex gainful employment law. Chevron goes away, that may go away. We don't know the impact generally, but we may really need a reauthorization of the Higher Education Act if Chevron is overturned.
Congress should do their job, apparently.
Well, let's not get carried away.
Yeah.
The state authorization section of the Higher Ed Act is about this long, so
Yeah,
it would
it's
be,
very
that's a
short.
fair question.
Thank you all,
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
and that is our contact information.